Hello, and welcome to Synthesized Sunsets. Today, we are joined by Xueting Christine Ni. Xueting is a translator, essayist, and fellow superfan of web fiction, or Wǎngwén. She grew up in cities across China before moving to the UK and studying the literature of both countries, giving her a unique perspective on the boundaries between East and West. She became known to the sci-fi world after publishing the anthology Sinopticon, a celebration of Chinese science fiction, to wide critical acclaim. In 2024, she published a second collection, Sinophagia, a celebration of Chinese horror. Xueting, we're very excited to have you on the show. One thing that I've kind of wondered about the Chinese genre fiction scene is I would say that in the United States, sci-fi and fantasy are kind of loosely part of the same market. But when I look at Chinese genre fiction as an outsider, it feels like not only might they be further apart, but also fantasy on its own contains genres that are like more different from each other than anything you would see in the range of Western fantasy for the most part. The people who are reading like Xianxia, for example, are probably not the same people who are reading like Tolkien, or not necessarily. So I was wondering, like, is this broadly accurate, or would you say that like the book market is structured in a different way?
It's different from how it is in the West, in that there was an explosion of different genres and subgenres with the development and flourishing of internet literature. I was quite impressed that someone mentioned that could use the name Wangwén properly and Xianxia. Doesn't often happen when I go on events and panels. But there are so many different divisions of subgenres at the moment within the Chinese broadly broad sweep of fantasy. You have like xuanhuan, xiuzhen, qihuan, and then xianxia, and all these other genres as well. Hundreds and hundreds. I come across a lot of conversations about what can be classified as xianxia, what can be classified as wuxia, or is it cultivation novel? Is it actually just supernatural tale? But I mean, does it really matter that much at the end of the day? Because what one trait I found in the contemporary Chinese fiction scene is how the genres kind of blend into each other. They borrow from each other, and that's what makes it so dynamic in a way.
Mhm, mhm. Could you describe for us briefly, like, your entry point into these genres? Like, did you originally come across these genres through, like, some kind of web fiction platform? And also, were you exposed to Western genre fiction and Chinese genre fiction around the same time? Or was the discovery a little bit different for both?
So I grew up reading kind of classic Anglophone fiction from the literary canon. And then, I was kind of the typical good Chinese child, as it were, immigrant child, until I went to university and it all changed. I met all sorts of different people, lots of geeks who introduced me to genre fiction, science fiction, fantasy. And then it never stopped from there. Whereas with that Chinese fiction, I loved wuxia since I was a child. In the early 80s, it was everywhere. My earliest beginnings was listening to Jin Yong on the radio, like the aura of storytelling. And then later I read the novels. Then when around about the 2010s, when I started looking into web literature, first of all, it was the sci-fi literature. And then I read horror, and then I discovered that there's like a whole kind of range of uh, contemporary fantasy, wuxia xianxia, that's a kind of the evolved form of the classics. What we know, what we know as the kind of, some people think are the proper wuxia, but actually the genre never stopped evolving, and now it's quite different from where it was before. But there is a progress to that. So I think it's a different kind of journey between Western and Chinese fiction.
We definitely want to talk about web fiction a lot more, but before that happens, I did want to talk a little bit more about Synopticon. How would you describe your approach to curating translated works especially in terms of how it differs from the collections that are already out there. Like, could you say what Synopticon's like mission statement is?
I guess the title pretty much indicates what it is. It's a celebration of contemporary Chinese science fiction from the last 30 years with a wide range of styles, subject matter, generations of writers. It doesn't aim to be the best of Chinese fiction, but rather a celebration of it.
I do feel like you did a good job of capturing the full range. A lot of times in a curated collection, it's like, I guess, pretty obvious what the editor translator's genre sensibilities are. There's obviously like a specific type of science fiction that they have like a stronger preference for. But I think reading this collection, like I wasn't quite sure, like I think it would be hard to say what your like preferences for genre is. And so I think insofar as like it was your goal to provide a wide range of exposure, I think that's like a pretty good thing.
Thank you. I mean, my reading tastes are pretty eclectic, and I do aim to provide a wider range. Some maybe I have more of an affinity to than others, but I think that I would pick a piece if it was good writing and it was representative of something that's quite common to the literary field of China.
So earlier, like I guess kind of a little bit ago now, like a couple months ago, we actually had Regina Kanyu on the show, um, and she was talking about how there were like a couple stories that like didn't really make the cut for a very specific reason regarding like I guess like Western audience sensibilities. Would you say that happened in any case for this collection? Like, was there a story that you sort of wanted to put in there, but then like your editor or publisher was kind of like, yeah, like I don't know if this is really going to play super well in America or like in the UK?
I think there were stories I wanted to feature, but because I really liked them too, and only the pages of a book were limited, there was a piece by Wang Jinkang, who is the oldest science fiction writer on the collection. He's considered one of the four great masters of Chinese science fiction. His piece called Return of Adam was very much of its time. Your kind of space travel 1970s Flash Gordon type science fiction. And I knew I kind of ran a risk when I put that piece in there. And I did have queries from my publishers saying, don't you think this is kind of the male gaze and this is a sexist part? Do we really want to put it in there? And I said, well, this is quite typical of the science fiction that's coming out at the time in the 1990s. As a curator and editor, I can only reflect what was happening in the genre at the time. If these kind of sexist viewpoints were common, then I needed to reflect it rather than I know that it's a certain school of thinking for editors and translators to take those bits out because they're considered unpalatable to Western readers. But I think if they wrote it and it was published that way and it was accepted in China, I should leave it in there. And in my comments after the story, I did say, yes, this is very backward sexist writing, but the protagonist kind of foisted on his own petard later because it was a honey trap and, he got manipulated into upgrading into the second intelligence. It shows how far Chinese science fiction has come because you have someone like Wang Jinkang writing a piece like that. Overall, really good science fiction, but with kind of sexist views. But then you have somebody like Nian Yu, the youngest writer, at the other end. I think her piece is from the 2010s, writing a very kind of gender neutral point of view, even maybe typically masculine point of view. And if you didn't know she was the author of Cat's Chance in Hell, if you didn't know she was female, maybe you wouldn't think so. So we've come a long way from 30 years ago, and that's what I wanted to show as well.
Yeah, I did
Yeah.
appreciate in that Return of Adam's story. Is that the title? That I think you mentioned this in the comment as well, but it's sort of like him having these backwards views sort of fit thematically and as well, and that he's kind of like being thrust into the future, and then like maybe at the time he wouldn't look so backwards and stuff, but like now as like we read this story, we can kind of look back and it sort of fits. He seems like more out of time sort of as a result of us like reading this story later.
See, that's a
Um,
very interesting point.
what it reminded me a little bit of is I'm sure you're familiar with this, but a couple of years ago, the WorldCon, and the Hugo Awards for science fiction and fantasy were hosted in Chengdu, China, and I think that kind of like an under talked about effect of this is that there were a ton of just normal Chinese readers that nominated stories for the following Hugo Awards. Just stories that they want to see on the ballot, and this ended up making up like a good chunk of the nomination block. As a result, there were like these stories that ended up on the ballot that were just not super palatable to Western readers, and I think that Western readers are kind of used to only getting Chinese science fiction like heavily filtered through the sensibilities of like Neil Clark and Ken Liu, and like stories that these translators know are going to play well with Western audiences. But then when they got these stories that are kind of just like, I mean, I don't know if more typical is the right word, but like more like not really curated to play well with Western audiences. There's this very interesting Reddit thread where people are just complaining about like the Chinese submissions to the Hugo nominations because they reflect backwards views, or they're just like written in this very kind of like golden age style, and people are theorizing. They're like, wow, I wonder if like the CCP like put them up to this. But like, in fact, like there are some ways in which like Western and Chinese genre preferences don't line up. And so I think this is like a very interesting clash of cultures to witness like over the internet.
Yeah, I'm aware of the enthusiastic voting, the Chinese fans kind of raising the votes by all voting for their favorite story. And really fascinating that it's actually meant that Western readers could see some of the stories that they don't usually see. I mean, I'm a curator who's always trying to tempt the Anglophone reader to get into something that they don't normally get into. So this is a surprise to me. So I'd be interested to know which stories you thought were particularly odd to you.
Well, I think there was that one or two stories that were Wang Jinkang that got nominated.
Oh,
Um,
right, okay.
and then
Yeah.
there was also, I think there was also a story by like He Shi, who's like
Yes.
another one of the four or people that you
Yeah.
mentioned, or one of the four great Chinese writers. That was sort of like, I don't know. I mean, I don't recall exactly which of the works were nominated. If I remember correctly, I think one thing that sort of didn't play super well with Western audiences is there's this one story where one of the major plot points of the story was that the main character was kind of like disfigured in some way, or just like kind of like ugly, and the author like didn't really mince words about this. Like they were kind of just like they didn't try to place any sort of value judgment on this, but they were just like, ah, yes, this character was just like really really ugly, and like nobody really liked him as a
Oh,
result.
dear.
That was one specific thing I
Yeah.
remember being kind of controversial.
This, this kind of attitude towards physical diversity
Right.
is a conversation that I sometimes have to have with the writers. Do you really mean this, or what exactly do you mean? And the fiction needs to be read in context of the social developments. I mean, recognizing the validity of different types of physiques and features is something that Chinese society is becoming more aware of, and more supportive of. And that's just happening. So they're at a very different stage to maybe the US or Europe. And
Mhm.
I think the fiction needs to be read in that context.
Right, right. So, moving on to stories that are actually in Synopticon, I think for both Gordon and myself, our favorite story was The Great Migration. by Ma Boyong. And this story basically imagines a world in which it's pretty normal to travel between Earth and Mars. But it is actually like really, really difficult to get a ticket to go back to Earth from Mars because there's only a limited transit window in which you can do it. And there are a lot of people who want to go from Earth to Mars, kind of obviously, because there are some benefits to being on Earth as opposed to Mars. And so the story follows these two people who are kind of like desperately trying to get their tickets to Earth and sort of trying to like outwit each other, but also their fellow ticket seekers. And I guess I felt like the story was very, I think it was kind of like an interesting blend of moods. Like, I think that like at times it kind of felt very like epic and cinematic. Like you mentioned in your notes that it was in some way inspired by like the migration into certain Chinese cities, but you have these scenes that are just like all these people and it's just like very epic. But then you have these other situations in the story where it's just kind of like more of like a relaxed and chill vibe where they're kind of like in this weird holding pattern as like their journey to get tickets is delayed for whatever reason. And then you also have like these really fun romantic moments as well. So we both really enjoyed this story. I had one actually very specific question about the story, and in particular like a translation moment that I really appreciated. So there's this part where they say that during every great migration, Olympus gets so crowded that Mars tilts a few degrees further on its axis. And the other character responds, "Is that a joke?" And they say back, "It's a Red Planet joke. I guess you haven't read enough to get it." Obviously, like this pun is not going to work in Chinese. Like it's not the same language. So I was wondering, like, was there original pun there that like you were just like translating, or do you like see an opportunity for a pun that you could insert there to like make it funnier, or like how did that particular choice come about?
That's a very specific question. It's been a few years since I translated it, so I don't remember exactly what the Chinese was. I think there would be a pun in Chinese which was adapted into English. That's more likely
Uh-huh.
to be my style of translation.
Yeah, because I think like a lot of the time when you're reading a translated work, it's kind of unclear like where the style of the writer ends and where the style of the translator begins, right? Like if you read a story and you like it, you're unsure like, okay, how much of this is like part of the translator like doing a good job? But like I remember that was a moment where I was just like, ah, yes, the translator did this.
Yeah.
I also appreciated how like I feel like a lot of the times translators don't really talk a ton about like more granular aspects of their translation process. It's more like we'll have kind of like one page at the very end of like a novel or something, and we're just like, well, this is generally my approach, and this is like this one big choice that I made that you may or may not like. But it was kind of cool that in this collection, how because you had a translation note after like every story, it gave a lot of insight into what you're trying to go for. And I think honestly, I enjoyed reading the notes like just as much as the stories. Like I feel like the notes are really quite interesting. I would say they're even more interesting in Sinophagia, honestly. Like there was a lot of stuff in Sinophagia where I was just like, huh. It definitely caused me to reevaluate some of the stuff about the story looking back. So that was really cool as well.
Because it seemed to work so well with Synopticon, and it was my first anthology, I decided to take this approach, add comments at the back of the story so you can come to the story afresh. And if you wanted to find out more, you can read the notes. It seemed to work really well. Readers really like it. So I kind of try to refine the process for Sinophagia in talking to the authors a bit and then doing a bit of research, made them a little more lengthy, maybe made them meatier, as the readers really seem to enjoy them. But my approach is basically something that supports heterogeneity of culture. So I would always try and keep the cultural element of the original language as much as I can in the English language, but also making that flow. So that the Red Planet thing is part of that. And in the Great Migration, you might have read the phrase flogging. That would be like flogging a dead horse. They were talking about trying to get tickets trying to get the guy on the bus to help, and the protagonist says that's like flogging a dead horse. That comes from a Chinese idiom, and it was adapted into English. Whereas maybe some other translator might want to just completely lose the phrase and redo it in English. I would always try and be creative and inventive, even though it might take a bit more time, a bit more effort. I would like to retain the cultural elements in the original language. But I'm really glad you like that piece, that story, because it's not a very usual science fiction story, as Ma Boyong is somebody who is tempted to write science fiction. He writes a whole lot of other stuff, historical and fantasy novels. He's very well known for them in China, and he's great at doing these epic scenes, but great on his character details too.
Mm-hmm. I recognize the name from like other genre contexts, and I was like, "Wait, is this the same guy?" But yeah, like I was like pleasantly surprised to see some science fiction by him.
Yeah, he's been really well known for like the Tang Dynasty, his historical fantasy, and at the moment there is his novel called The Lychees of Chang'an, which is a great sweeping epic about how in the dynastic times the emperor wanted lychees, and he's all the way in the north of China, and lychees only grow in the south of China. They have to deliver it to him and quickly enough for the fruit to be fresh. So it's a sweeping journey, but he focuses on the delivery person, who is like just this ordinary guy. So again, you've got the differences of perspective. This is the stuff that Ma Boyong is usually known, but I think he's done a great piece for Sinopticon. I think that one was an original he hadn't published before, so published
Oh,
for the
really?
first time in English. Yeah, surprisingly relevant to contemporary China and probably to future, because you picked up the point about the migration. It happens every year during Lunar Festival, where it's a massive movement of crowd of the migrants who work in cities where there are opportunities, and then they go back home for a month of holiday, and it's literally very, very kind of epic. If you Google it, you'll see the Spring Festival travels, and in the future, this might happen in space.
I did like in your note you kind of mentioned how there's this sense to which like you're all like competing, and then it ends up in like you're kind of just like comrades. Like I don't know if you've ever been on like some ridiculous like layover, like I don't know, it's like getting like a couple flights in a row canceled, and you're just kind of like moving around with a bunch of people who are all like hating their life simultaneously. It's like it sucks, but at the same time it's like you do feel a certain amount of like kinship with all these people. It's a sort of unique feeling. One thing I really liked about The Great Migration and a few of the other stories in Synopticon as well is I feel like sci-fi, at least in the West, is either kind of like not romantic at all, is like very physical or sexual, or occasionally it's like kind of like ridiculously romantic, and it'll be some like this tragic love like across like the limits of space and time, and you know and then like they'll die and never get to see each other or something. Which there's one of those stories in this collection as well. And to be clear, I don't have anything against those. Those are pretty great. But like the Great Migration and the zombie one, which was Flower of the Other Shore, I believe,
Yeah.
and maybe a couple other ones. I think they struck a good balance of like definitely having actual romance, but sort of being kind of like fun and flirty and not like super over the top as well. And I was wondering if I haven't really seen that much in sci-fi before, in the West at least. Do you think that's more common in China? Do you think romance in general is like a bit more focused on?
Well, that's some really interesting points. I think you put very succinctly that science fiction has a lot of wishful thinking, whether it is with a lot of sex or over the top romance or no sex at all. I think with the Chinese storytelling, it's a different tradition of storytelling. There's certainly more nuanced approach to imaginings of the future, and that's something quite distinct with maybe Chinese and Asian science fiction. Is something Sinofuturism and the reclamation thereof is something I've talked about at other panels and interviews as well. What I really like is well integrated writing, where you have the science element, but you also have the story and the characterization is all integrated into one piece. I think maybe that's what you're also seeing from the stories in Sinopticon. It usually is not all terrible, not that not everybody dies and the world ends in the end. Usually there's something pretty terrible that's happened, but people are kind of aware of it and they're getting through it. That's something I really like about Chinese science fiction. I guess with a romantic element as well, it's part of the storytelling. It's part of, I don't know, how relationships naturally are, you know, how they grow and how the writers perhaps imagine their characters, how they would interact. It's interesting. I've not the romance element and how natural it is hasn't been pointed out to me before, but that's interesting. I mean, whether it's romance or characterization or plot, what I'm really looking for in a collection is stories that tell them well at the end of the day.
One story that I did want to talk about briefly, which just in the interest of time, is The Waking Dream from Sinophagia. So The Waking Dream is, I thought, probably the scariest story in the collection. Basically follows a world in which it's very normal to have completely remote work, where you just kind of put on this VR headset and you're able to work. And the idea is that you're kind of like free of any physical ailments, and it's just fair, and like it allows people to just like be more productive workers. But the protagonist ends up in the situation where she just feels a lot of like, I don't know if it's like kind of nausea, general like disembodiment related sickness, and she starts to see these like literal monsters that are attached to various coworkers that she has like in cyberspace. I thought that this story was particularly scary in that like I have also worked remote for a very long time, and like at times I'm sort of just vaguely just get this sense of unease where it's like, yes, this like state of disembodiment was like not really good for my soul. Extrapolating it out to like a more extreme level, not only did it seem a little bit scary, but I could also just like definitely imagine that being the case. But also I thought that your note was kind of like scary also, where like in your note you were just talking about how there's a lot of like abusive work culture in China that people kind of all know is a problem, but it's just kind of proves stubborn to like moderate at all. And you talk about how the author, who writes under the name Fan Zhou, I think it was, she like writes under a pseudonym, and not only is this like kind of a little bit like spooky in this case, but this is also not uncommon. You know, there are people that just write about their work in a way that's like maybe a bit sensitive, and they have to use a pseudonym as a result. But of course, in China, it's much harder to have like, you know, true pseudonymity. I guess all of this to say that like at the end of the story, I was not only like a little bit scared of the concept of the story, but also just like, like I hope this author and people in her situation are gonna like end up doing okay. So I was wondering if you could shed some light on like this particular area of like online fiction and just like how you came across it.
Yeah, I found that story really, really scary, and I liked it immediately after I read it. It's scary in a psychological way, definitely, which is a lot of how horror is developing in China. It's so visceral and surprisingly relevant because it absolutely addresses some very real issues that people in tech and big data industries have campaigned for in China. Those kind of unspokenly but tacitly agreed working hours, and they can't really get out of because of the industry pressures, and everything is going very meta in the metaverse, and people are holding conventions, meetings, and it's definitely going that way. So it's a very scary and real situation, and I think the writer has translated it into horror really well. She's the most private of the writers I've worked with, although I've got some new anthologies that are really sensitive too. But up till that point, when we did the reveals, she only showed the drawn portrait of herself, definitely uses a pen name, but she's made it quite clear that she works in a completely ordinary industry that has nothing to do with her writing. So we kind of know that it does have to do with her writing, and she can't say. So yeah, I just think it's a really scary situation too. And amazingly, with a female protagonist that is very strong, who seems like quite quiet and contained, but is also very strong. Everything that she has to deal with is she cannot tell anyone about. And that's another thing that's so scary about it. It's all happening in your head. Is it real? Is it not real? And can you trust the person who is supposed to be a friend?
So the way that we found out about your work is we recently read the collection The Way Spring Arrives, which was edited by Regina, Kanyu Wang, and others. And you contributed an essay to this collection called Net Novels and the She Era, where you touch on some pretty similar themes. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, when Regina approached me, asked me to contribute, I wanted to translate one of the stories too, but I was working on Sinopticon at the time, and the final stages, and I only had time to do an essay. And at the time, what I was telling you about earlier in the podcast, I had kind of discovered a lot more about this explosive development of internet literature after I've been reading this science fiction, which has kind of been a slightly different community to the rest of the fantasy. And so I was really fascinated, and went on to study it for my master's degree, and before I researched it myself and wrote the article. And it has been happening in China for a decade or two now, and I thought it was about time for people in the West to know more about it, and certainly how the incredible amount of good drama productions and film productions was fueled by internet literature, and how liberating it has been for female writers and writers who need the flexibility of time and platform. Furthermore, I think the second half of the essay is about how kind of they changed the fantasy scene, because from this kind of direct parasocial response between the interaction between writer and readers, they can directly converse and it's a serialization, and the author can adapt what they're writing to their readers. It's very, very direct interaction and feedback. They've, completely changed the genre. They've invented a lot of new ones, new subgenres, and also because the internet space is a lot freer compared to print publishing, for example, in China. A lot of issues that have been bubbling under the surface have come up in internet fiction, and which is really wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought it was a pretty interesting angle for your piece to talk about how this has allowed more women to enter the the literature world, and just in general increase their exposure. It definitely makes sense, because any publishing gatekeeper is going to have some bias. It actually reminded me a little bit about how in America especially, but also the West more broadly, when YouTube first became popular, I feel like it actually massively increased the the cultural impact of Asians. If you look at the very earliest YouTube creators, A lot of them, like Ray William Johnson, I believe, Ryan Higa, Kev Jumba, like these were all like Asian Americans who didn't really like have any channels to receive exposure through like legacy media. But as a result of YouTube just allowing them to express themselves without any traditional gatekeepers, it kind of like, I think it did eventually pave the way for Asians being as prominent in legacy media as they are now. And so I think that it's pretty easy for me to believe that a similar thing is happening for women in media in China.
Yeah, women and maybe kind of queer writers
Mhm.
and any writers who might be marginalized or don't have the confidence to submit their work to print publishers. So all kinds, because they have direct feedback on the popularity of their work and they just need to put an avatar and a name. So there's no judgment on their appearance, sexuality, or any experiences that are considered more legit than others. So it's a very kind of level playing field.
One thing I want to talk about is the scale of Wǎngwén. Like, I think that in the United States, reading just like isn't really that popular as a hobby. I mean, it's like somewhat popular, but I think especially amongst men and young men in particular, it's like not really a hobby that's like on the level as some other forms of media consumption. As a result, like it's kind of difficult to like just how popular Chinese web fiction really is. So I was wondering, like, could you talk about like the general space that web fiction occupies in the culture? Like, how much awareness is there of web fiction, and like, what is the day to day like? Like, are you just often like on the bus and just like all the people are reading web fiction, or like what's that like?
Yeah, that's exactly what it's like. You're on the bus or on the train, and people are on their phones
That's kind of what I
reading web
imagined. It's
fiction.
like, yeah.
Yeah. So, from my research, from an industry level, every region or city have like an association of internet writers, and they have different awards for these writers, the league tables, etc. And then from a individual level, civilian level, it's really actually increased the literacy rate in China because the the urban rural divide is still very high, and the literacy rate still needs improving, and it's greatly improved that with mobile reading. So it's accessibility because everybody's got a phone now, a smartphone, especially that ties in with the smartphone revolution. Most of the content is free until you get to a certain amount of, you get chapter 30 or something and you like the piece, you can pay a bit to download the whole novel. It's very convenient. It means that, whether you're a cleaner or a waitress or, a carer, if you've got a spare half an hour, 20 minutes during your break, you can get your phone out and you can read a chapter or so. Super convenient. And the apps are all very geared towards, what kind of backgrounds you want and how you want to flick through the pages is really, really convenient to use. So,
Mhm.
in terms of that, the internet revolution has really made reading more accessible to more people. I know that there is still a certain attitude towards more kind of orthodoxly educated population about internet literature, but it has had a massive effect on the reading in the habits of the general public in that it's increased it. And also you can find anything you like on it, whether you like military history, romances, erotica, kind of office office fiction, anything, space novels, thrillers, any genre you like. And in terms of kind of what I'm working at the moment on wuxia fiction, I find it really fascinating because wuxia and xianxia is a genre that works really well on serialization. I mean, it's always been serialized since the historical times. It used to be told in segments in the tea house, and then it was serialized in newspapers, and people couldn't wait for the next instrument. And then it was on TV every night, and you couldn't wait to talk about it with your colleagues. And now it's serialized in the apps where the writers are uploading a chapter every 5 days, and the readers are sending them little bombs, reminders to say, can you upload the next one soon? They're kind of on the edge of their seats waiting to read the next one. And that's how wuxia works best, because it's these long, great stories of exciting, swashbuckling adventures that work really well.
One thing I was wondering if you could shed some light on is I would say that there have definitely been efforts to export the Chinese model of web fiction to the West. You had mentioned this a bit earlier, but a lot of things, like a lot of the time what will happen is you'll have this big platform that will host a lot of web fiction, and there will be this sort of microtransaction model where at the beginning you can front load with like all of this content, but then after that you have to like somehow use coins to like unlock chapters, or there is some kind of way in which this is able to be monetized and institutionalized. And this is part of what allows the industry to be so big and sustainable. But in the West, maybe a year ago or 2 years ago, there was this app called Yonder. It was the same model. Like they tried to have these epic fantasy stories that are distributed in like chapter installments. And, I think it had some money behind it, but this just totally flopped. Like nobody used it. They're just like, oh, why would we why would we do this? So I was wondering, like, to what extent do you think that the lack of popularity of web fiction in the West compared to Asia is due to cultural things relating to like how stories have been told versus like just platform inertia, and like how much is it related to just like other things? And also, like, do you think there is a pathway to web fiction becoming really mainstream in the West?
I think it's probably a bit from each column, that it's a different culture of reading here to in China. In China, the stories are either really short or they're huge 4-volume novels that kind of the readers find accompanying them in their everyday life. They like to go into the story a bit and then a bit the next day. So that is very, very conducive to web fiction, which are usually quite long. And maybe there isn't that reading habit in the West, although we did have a lot of episodes of TV dramas that people liked. So that's a similarity. And probably also with the development of the industry, it's taken the Chinese internet platforms a few decades to refine their infrastructure, exploration and refining to get it right, to kind of align all the IPs and to enable writers to monetize it, give readers the best deal and protect the writers. There are still issues, as I pointed out in my essay, about how referential and homage prone these platform is. So in that writers talk to each other, they are influenced by each other's work, they might cross create a genre, then it becomes in a dispute, some kind of plagiarism claim. There is still issues to be worked on for the Chinese industry. So it still needs to be refined, but they, by and large, really, really developed it into a very advanced stage in China. And I think more other countries also read the fiction. They have people translating them, fan translations.
Oh yeah.
And maybe in the Western, is that, do you do that yourself, or do you read that too?
Yeah, I've read an amount of Zhangjia translated from Chinese, but yeah, neither of us translates though.
I have to. I have to say, I'm really, really grateful to the fan translators, because without them, Western audiences would never see these series that weren't officially licensed in the US or Europe. And then the fan translators who translated 魔道祖师, The Untamed, the novel, way before it was officially picked up. And this brings me to another, your question, Kevin, about what this would look like if web fiction had a market. It would kind of look like the 7 Seas list at the moment, which started shortly after the Wei Spring arrived. came out. As in, they started acquiring some web fiction, mainly for the dame list, so the boy love list. And I was really, really happy, really pleased that at least some fiction was contemporary Chinese fantasy was being picked up, and I really wanted them to publish some other materials other than boy love, but and which they're starting to now. They've started to publish some 九路飞香 and people like that who write, 仙侠 novels. So that's great. Although I do find, so you have a million of works in one platform, and there's bound to be some pretty crap novels, but there are some pretty good ones too. And it's just out of thousands, of tens and thousands, the good ones are picked out and they're published in print and they're adapted. So of course there is a view that they're just light fiction, which and it's a view that Seven Seas seems to have taken, because they're mainly a publisher of light fiction, manga, and light novels. However, as I've studied them and analyzed them in my papers and talked about them in my essays, I think there's a lot to good web fiction. Someone like Mo Xiang Tongxiu, or someone like Priest, for example, who writes sci-fi and wuxia. There's a lot of literary value, and they should be treated like a normal, Asian-inspired fantasy that are published in the US market. That's how they should be marketed, and not as some kind of light novel translated on a production factory line approach. Yeah, that's one of my pet peeves at the moment.
Yeah, we've talked about similar things for web fiction and mainstream science fiction in the West as well, because I feel like in China it's actually much further along. I think that web fiction has kind of gotten its flowers in some ways, whereas I feel like in America it's kind of sufficiently niche that people won't even really have heard of these books and will have these preconceived notions about what they are. That is starting to change. There was this pretty big web novel called Dungeon Crawler Carl that now has this mainstream book deal, and I think it's being more explicitly marketed as such. There have been a few crossover hits, but in terms of the books that feel really digital, I feel like it's been harder for those to gain traction. There actually are, I would say, a few novels that borrow from more Chinese style works and Korean style works. One thing I was wondering is, have you ever seen a particularly innovative use of the platform itself, some form of audience interaction or some way that the author was able to leverage the platform to do something that was super innovative and they wouldn't be able to do with print literature? Obviously, there are things you can do relating to asking the audience about where the story can go. But I was wondering if you've seen anything that's even crazier than that wouldn't have been possible before.
I think the breaking the fourth wall and commentary, direct commentary from the author, is definitely something that the web novelists can do. And some of them are really, really meta, kind of within the novel. The isekai genre, the Chinese equivalent of the portal fantasy, is really popular at the moment in web fiction. But that's within the novel itself, kind of about sometimes some after some freak accident. I'm sure you're familiar with isekai. That the character ends up with it in the world of the computer or their phone or the novel, but that happens within the novel itself rather than on the platform. In terms of more interesting interactions, story-wise, is I'm seeing a lot of common factors. For example, the Qidian, which is quite one of the major platforms. I've noticed that all their wuxia writers or qihua writers, they all feature the Tang clan, who are based on a clan in Sichuan in history. but they specialize in secret weapons, poisons, and things like that. And somehow, I don't know if they've coordinated or they've been in some kind of community chat or something. All of them have written this clan into their different novels that are completely different worlds. So it's kind of a crossing universe thing. And the other kind of very common device between the wuxia writers of this and xianxia writers of this platform is a mechanical contraption which rapidly shoots needles out to your opponent. That very quickly it kills them straight away, and all of them seem to be using this as a major plot turn.
Yeah. It's interesting how, like, in a very specific genre or something, you can have tropes like really like evolve and feed off each other. Like you were mentioning isekai earlier, and I feel like the first chapter for like isekai novels, like the first chapter is normally like the protagonist is doing something and then gets hit by a truck and gets sent to another world. And like now, like I feel like more recently stories have been getting like more and more ridiculous with like how they got hit by a truck. Like I remember I was reading something where like there's just like this massive, just like right at the start of the story, there's this massive alien invasion, and it's just like, oh, what's the alien ship? And then it's just like, it's a truck, it's a massive truck, and it's just like this truck that's like the size of a continent just crashes into Earth, and then the protagonist dies and wakes up in another world. And I feel like that can happen with a lot of things in web fiction because they're often like have a very specific niche they're going for, sort of. You can have all these tropes that sort of like play off of each other. And I think also a lot of the audience, it's like expected a lot of the audience will have like read a lot of similar stuff, kind of. They sort of know what's being referenced.
Yeah, that's right. So they're the part of the community, part of the readership, and there are a lot of in-jokes and references that mutual readers would get.
Okay, well, I think this is a pretty good time to wrap things up. As a final note, I was wondering if there was anything else you would like to plug, and also any particular short story that you would like to recommend.
I do have a novelette, newly translated novelette that's about to come out. So I'd recommend, it's by a new female science fiction writer, and I'd recommend that people keep an eye on my social media, look out for the story when it comes out. Yeah, so I'm always working on a range of projects, so kind of the current thing is what comes to mind. Yeah, so I would actually like to ask you both a question to, as it were, plug the book I'm querying on wuxia culture, which is taking a global approach to the storytelling. Because whilst it's an Asian thing, it's been around for a long time, actually, and also made it into the US through, things like the Kung Fu craze, and now we have the current crop of dramas. I wanted to, and many readers have told me they would like to read this book, and I was wondering, for the two of you, what was your introduction into xianxia and wuxia?
When I was towards the end of high school, I got really into like reading a lot of Western web fiction. This is about like 8 years ago. I got like 2017, 2018 around. And then I started like some amount of stuff had been, because Chinese web fiction is so much bigger. Like some of the biggest Western web fiction is just like translated like xianxia or wuxia. So I would say that's kind of when I had introduction towards that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it was sort of the similar way. I mean, I think I was honestly like first introduced to it just like through Gordon, but I feel like I was also ambiently exposed to it as a result of being in university with other with Chinese students who would sometimes mention it as a hobby. And like if I hadn't been exposed to the idea before, I probably wouldn't have thought much of it. But I was just like, oh, it's really interesting that all these people seem to have listed reading web fiction as one of their hobbies.
Oh, excellent. So it sounds like you both come to the genre through its current, iteration of web fiction. And so my book is going to draw the connections between that and people like Jin Yong, the classic writers, and also to the developments in film and comics in the 70s US. So hopefully, yeah, I hope to find a home for it soon.
Yeah. I will say I've seen like various like martial arts movies and stuff growing up earlier that you could say are like maybe sort of related, but like less in the like fantasy martial arts realm. Like, I don't know, a movie like Enter the Dragon or something is sort of different, I feel like.
Aha, they're more related than you think.
Hmm.
Thanks so much for coming on, and we will see you all next week.
Welcome back. So, any thoughts on the episode, Kevin?
Yeah, so I was pretty excited to do this particular interview because I've just been on this like general, pretty deep Chinese science fiction kick that has culminated in me like trying to learn Mandarin. So obviously I have gotten pretty into it. Something that I noticed in this episode, which is something that we'll definitely have to think about for future episodes, is when I was going into the episode, I was imagining we'd spend a lot of time talking about the stories, right? Because this is what like the premise of this interview. But when I like actually thought about this, it's like, there are a lot of these stories I don't even have like a particular question that I want to ask. I just feel like they're good stories. So if you notice, like in the interview, there is sort of a point at which I think we both kind of realize that like there's a lot of stuff we can just say about these stories in the afters that like do not really require input. And so we just are probably going to talk more in detail about those stories right now. But yeah, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah. Alongside that, I think we probably should have just talked about the stories a bit more in the episode, especially given
Oh,
that we can be like, we're fans of these stories, and she's obviously fans of all of these stories. Otherwise, she wouldn't have put them into her anthology, right?
uh,
So I think we probably could have taken like a more we like this about this one and whatnot, and we did that a bit for the Great Migration, I think
yeah.
specifically, which I think went well talking about it.
I think one thing about this episode is I think like in the past we've had more of the approach of like having the person give like an elevator pitch for the work and then going off of that. But this is often like not gone super well, and we've often had more success by just like introducing it ourselves. Obviously, this is like very variable, but I think something that's different about this situation is like Xueting is not actually the author, right? Like she's actually
Yeah.
the curator, and so in fact, she is probably like the best person at giving the elevator pitch, as opposed to if she was the author of these stories. Like if that makes sense.
When you're talking with the author of a story, it's sort of weird to have like if you have questions about like the process coming up with the story, that's awesome. But if you just want to be like, this story was so cool because like blah 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 blah, and like like this one part was kind of cool, it's like a bit awkward. The author's like, thanks, yeah. Yeah, that was on purpose. Yeah, I did write that part. It's like they can't really have like an author's not gonna have like a take about their work really, because they're not really in the place. I mean, okay, they could, I guess, possibly, especially if there's someone who writes a bunch of stuff. Like they might have like, like when I was doing this book, I was like that. But if you're like talking to an author about like coming from the perspective of being like a fan of their work, I feel like it's often hard to have like a really interesting dialogue, because like obviously just like one of you is the authority on this subject and one of you is not.
Yeah, yeah. The take I want to say about this, it's actually kind of related to the article, but we can talk about some stories first.
Okay. Yeah. So, the stories that were my favorite. So we talked about the Great Migration, which was both of our favorite one. Then other ones were, Flowers of the Other Shore, by wait, do you know how to pronounce this? Akre.
It's like, oh man, Tue, no, Tue, Tue.
It's Tue? Wait, it's
It's
QUE though,
Q,
right?
yeah. Q is like you make a ch sound, but you jam your tongue into like the bottom hard palate, like behind your front teeth. So it's like ch, but then you put your tongue on
Acque.
the bottom of your
Okay,
mouth.
okay. Okay, so
Okay.
this story, Flower of the Other Shore by Acque, it was sort of like this zombie apocalypse one, but told from the perspective of a zombie who just like brain and stuff is completely intact, but it sort of still has these like zombie urges to like eat brains and stuff. And is
They have
unable.
like a zombie limbic system, sort of, right?
Yeah,
But,
exactly.
yeah.
Like their animalistic nature is that of a zombie, but their higher functioning consciousness is still that of a person. And then they're sort of like more human than other zombies. They kind of become more human, like due to this flower that grows on them and whatnot. But he basically discovers the place, which is where like he doesn't really have memories of his past life, but like he basically discovers what believes to be his like girlfriend in this apartment, which is like where he like left to go get food or something, and then got turned into a zombie and kind of left her holed up there. And it's sort of this romantic story about this zombie in person, but it's also like quite funny and it goes a lot of places. Pretty long story, but has a good twist. Really enjoyed it.
The story was quite interesting. I think in some ways it kind of had some like wandering in vibes. I don't know if you agree. Like, I think there
Yeah.
were some parallels. Both like there was that early plot arc in the Wandering In about the florist who kind of
Uh-huh.
like becomes zombified. This definitely has like a way different vibe from that, but I think there were like some parallels in terms of like how it felt to be reading. It was a lot longer than the other stories. Yeah, I don't know. I think it earned its length. There was a lot there. It definitely didn't feel like a much longer story to me.
hmm And then the other story that would be good to talk about that I enjoyed quite a bit is the Regina Kanyu one. So Regina obviously was on our podcast previously, but we didn't actually talk about this story at all because we hadn't read it at that time. So this story, The Tide of Moon City, I would say this story reminded me of like The Dispossessed. Definitely like more
Yeah.
than and anything else. It has a similar situation where there's kind of these two societies, and one is kind of like a smaller one on a moon that's like a bit more like, I don't know, idealistic. It's told from the perspective of a like one scientist on this like larger world who kind of like falls in love with this dude and also partners on scientific project. But yeah, I mean it's kind of like it doesn't work out. I guess I will say, and it's sort of a story of like regret and longing and like romance, but like in a sad sense. And I think something really interesting about this story for me is I would say in general I'm a very like pro forgiveness person, and as a result, like whenever a character is like it's like a situation where it's like they could forgive them or they could not, I'm generally on the forgiveness side. And this is one of the only times I've ever read a story of the character's like, oh, like I forgive you, and I'm like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, how can you possibly forgive them in this situation? Like I was like actually like, holy shit, this is insane. Like, I don't know, if people just start forgiving people for stuff like this, like you couldn't even have a society that remotely functions. Like I don't even think it was like a morally good action.
I had kind of an interesting experience reading this story because I was actually, at the time of reading it, kind of trying to write a story with a similar setting and was thinking about, like, how could I create the right vibe where you have, like, this one planet and there's some kind of, like, academic research going on. There's just kind of, like, this planet with, like, other political views where someone comes over. And then I read this story and I'm like, well, I guess that's what you would do. Like, that was pretty good. But yeah, I mean, this story was a really pleasant reading experience, and I also did like how the frame story was set up. I think a lot of the time I find frame stories to be kind of gimmicky. Like I'm
Mhm.
just like this, you could have just told this in real time, but I think in this case it was pretty appropriate.
Yeah. I mean, it's not even completely a frame story either, right?
Like, what do you mean?
Well, I would say like the main narrative finishes in the frame story.
Yeah, I mean the climax happens out of frame, I would say.
What's up?
It's in the frame story and not in the frame.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's kind of generally how I feel about frame stories. It's like I can enjoy them when there's something important to the plot occurring, with the frame story, but if it's like just like my grandfather sat down to tell me a tale of his youth, and then it's just the tale of his youth, and that's all. I'm like, yeah, okay.
I feel like so many fantasy books do this.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty common. And it's like, it doesn't, like, make it bad, the whole story. It obviously doesn't have that strong of an effect, but it's just, like, a little bit, like, makes it a bit
Okay,
worse.
my biggest pet peeve is, like, unnecessary flash forwards at the beginning of stories. Like, this just happens so often. And so often it, like, adds nothing. It's just, like, a cheap hook because the beginning of the story is, like, not that interesting. It doesn't, like, hook you. And the filmmaker or the director just kind of wants to have, like, an excuse for something like
I feel like this is kind of even a more common thing for movies than books.
It's just so irritating. Like they don't want to they don't have confidence in their ability to hook you with the normal beginning of the story. Like, what if we just put a really exciting part from the end in the beginning? That would work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can really work well if it's like a puzzle type thing. Like, I don't know, like I thought the start of Inception was really good, even though like
that's true. Yeah,
like that is a flash forward, right?
But I feel like that's
actually, also like whack.
No, but like, I feel like that's actually different because in fact what's going on in real time is more exciting than that.
Yeah, that's true actually. That's a good point.
Like,
it's like an anti-hook.
Like, that's a flash.
Yeah.
You a flash forward to make it less interesting.
Yeah, you have this super exciting, like, action-y adrenaline start to, like, a heist movie type thing, but, like, no, our actual hook is he's gonna just, like, wake up on some random-ass beach and just be like,
Oh, that's such a good hook.
Love that movie.
Okay.
I do feel like sci-fi is kind of particular, like a sci-fi setting is kind of particularly good at telling this type of like wistful longing type love story of like we're meant for each other, but we can like never, we can never be together. I mean, like mainly just from a sense of like space is big. Like I feel like this type of I feel like this type of story is like a pretty common story of like more classic older literature when like I don't know, the Earth was like comparatively bigger in people's experience, but it's a lot harder for this to like actually happen nowadays, I mean, like obviously it still can, but people who are like actually like both in love with each other and like would want to get married being like separated by distance is like a lot harder to set in modernity. But in space, makes a lot of sense. So you recently published a long-awaited article here on looking at analyzing Duban, which is like Chinese Goodreads ranking of science fiction books in comparison to the West. Want to tell us a little bit about that?
So this is an article that I've kind of been wanting to write ever since writing that first article about China, and maybe even before then, which was like 3 months ago, more, kind of a while
it's been
ago.
A bit. I don't know.
Part two. But it's kind of the culmination of like my fascination with what is popular in other cultural contexts. This is kind of a long-standing interest of mine, like way back when I used to write about pop music. I was quite interested in like the degree to which pop music can kind of like become popular in like not its home country, and that's like a whole other rabbit hole. But I am definitely pretty interested in how China evaluates cultural works like after importation in all domains, but I think science fiction is particularly interesting. So essentially my thesis is that while Chinese science fiction reads a lot of the same works as Western science fiction, because they are kind of this outsider that has absorbed like all these books, like kind of in like a shorter moment, they're able to have a certain kind of like interesting objectivity through which to reevaluate these works, like and kind of see the entire body of work as it is and not be as biased by like events that were occurring at the time. And so as a result, I think they have an interesting perspective to offer on Western science fiction. And further, I feel that even though obviously China is going to know more about Chinese science fiction in a relative sense than America, I would say that most Chinese science fiction fans I've talked to are much more familiar with Western science fiction than Chinese science fiction, with the exception of Cixin Liu, who is like way more famous than any of these people.
It's really interesting, just as kind of a thought experiment thing, to like look at this list of different books and just like try to imagine, even if it's like not scientific and like you have no idea whether this is actually legitimate, just like, you know, for each random book that's like really popular in China and not as popular in the West, it's like, oh, like why would this be, or whatnot. And I do think there's a sense where for better or for worse, like a lot of evaluation of books gets like very tied up in the like narrative stuff about the author, like the moment in which it came out, like what was happening in the world at that time. And I don't think these are necessarily bad things. They're all things that can like add to kind of the interest and enjoyment in reading a book, but it also might allow, you know, some maybe, or some, I don't want to say like worse. Okay, yeah, I'll say worse though. Maybe like some less good books to kind of overshadow maybe better ones because they came out in a better moment.
Yeah, I think a green flag for any kind of work is if it wasn't popular at the very start of it coming out. Like if something becomes popular after it comes out, like even like a year after or something.
Yeah,
I feel like
yeah,
that's a pretty strong signal. Like, oh, this is actually like pretty good. It's not just fluky.
yeah,
Because I think a lot of things that are kind of get popular but aren't really that good in retrospect are kind of just like super hyped when they come out. People are like, oh, it's hype. But then like a few years later, people are like, well, yeah, I don't know, maybe it wasn't that hype.
yeah. Fair.
And I feel this way about several things.
Was there any specific book from looking at this list that you were the most like, I need to read that, like it's definitely better than just like purely based on like looking at the data, like it's likely better than I've been led to believe or something, or yeah.
I was thinking probably Changing Planes by Ursula K. Le Guin,
Okay,
which
yeah.
I think is obscure. Like I've never heard
Uh-huh.
of this book. And I know like a good amount of Ursula K. Le Guin books. But yeah, I mean in China it's like the fourth most popular Ursula K. Le Guin book. It's like, okay. I think it's like
Yeah.
her second least popular novel after like The Beginning Place. Yeah, so I'm pretty interested in reading that. Separately, I think that there were a few hypotheses I had that were actually wrong. I tried my best not to be like wrong, even though obviously there is some degree to which you'll have to simplify things to tell a story about what's happening. One thing I was wrong about, like in the drafts, is there was a lot of Stanislaw Lem from Poland. And this kind of led me to believe that, like, China must have a lot more Eastern Bloc science fiction because there's not the same sort of political taboo. In fact, like, they'd be encouraged to import sort of like communist type, socialist type works. And this is like me theory crafting. I'm like, oh yeah, I wonder like how much Soviet stuff they've imported. But actually, no. They actually like China actually has less Soviet science fiction than the United States.
Uh-huh.
They do like Lem a lot more. And I think that is in part due to Lem having like specific beef with like American science fiction and people not really liking him. But even like the Strugatskys and stuff like that, who are pretty much the only like proper Soviet proper authors to make it in the US, like they're not even really popular in China to my knowledge. And so that was a hypothesis I tested and decided was just like not accurate. But the other thing that I think I was wrong about is the thing about like I think in my original article where I compared Chinese sci-fi to the golden age sci-fi, I was always like a little bit uneasy with like the capital A accuracy of the statement because if you look at like Cixin Liu or whatever, like obviously he has books like Son of China where it's just like very techno optimistic and kind of classic, but the actual work itself, like Santi, it's like very much not that hopeful as a story.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, it's like it's a little bit, and it's like quite sociological as well. And there's a lot of like exploration of ideas that are not gadgets. And in particular, it's not even that focused on gadgets in general, right? Like it's more
Yeah,
focused on
yeah.
these like big ideas. And so I think that a lot of this was informed by me reading stuff by like Wang Jinkang and other stuff that was like on the Hugo ballots. It sort of had like a golden agey vibe. But like Cixin Liu himself, who I think more than anyone else defines what Chinese science fiction is, isn't like that golden agey. But I think the way to solve this problem is that actually he is like Arthur C. Clarke. You know, like
Mhm.
similarly to Arthur C. Clarke, he is exploring these other themes, and his stories aren't like overly focused on gadgets or having that same kind of like old timey style as much. But at the same time, like he kind of has a different demographic of fans that is not necessarily aligned with like the front of the genre. You know, like most people reading Arthur C. Clarke are not the sorts of people that were reading like new wave or even like knew what new wave is, and it kind of takes time for these changes to like percolate down. I feel like this explains why like The Martian was just the best-selling sci-fi novel of the 2010s in the US, besides like Three Bodies. Like I feel like it really just hits this demographic that's like outside of the normal group of people that buy science fiction. And it's just like people that really are really into like the engineering mindset and like solving problems, you know, the people who are into popular science in like the 80s. And so I think The Martian was able to just capture this audience when there hadn't really been a book to do that for a while. I think that's just why it sold like a bajillion copies. Like there is still a lot of demand for that kind of stuff if it does come out and is good.
Yeah, I mean, like my sister-in-law, for example, who's like a math and chemistry major but doesn't really read too much, but very scientifically minded, is like, I don't know, The Martian's one of the only books I've fiction books I've seen her read. And yeah, it's like definitely a very attractive book for a type of person that just like might not read that much fiction in general.
But yeah, also talking to more people in China, which I did do a bit of for this episode, I can confirm that there are a lot of people that like definitely know Three Body, especially after the show came out, even before, but just like don't really know anything about science fiction outside of it. They just think that Three Body is like really cool. Like, you know, pretty much every conversation that I've had about science fiction has been something about like 你喜欢科幻 ma. And then they're just like, you know, like Santi. And I'm like, yeah. And then, but then as it continues, like, they don't really have takes on like any other sci-fi books. They're just like, yeah, this book. And I think there's also just like not really necessarily an awareness that it's like popular in like the US. Like some
Uh-huh.
people know, but I think it's like, oh, like they're like they always ask if you like know. Whereas
Yeah,
like I don't
yeah.
know, I feel like people who are into science fiction in the U.S. would obviously know about it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
but yeah, I mean, it has been kind of funny to have conversations about science fiction. Like, there's this one woman I was talking to who is just like not very good at English, but a little bit better than I am at Chinese, and I'm not good at Chinese. And like, she was asking me like a science fiction author that I liked, and I was saying that I like Ted Chiang, and then she was just like, you can like describe one of his stories, and I was kind of like, so like, there's this part where I'm just like trying to describe like Tower of Babylon, and I was just like, tower. There is a tall building, and then I'm just like, like what's the name for tower? Like tall building. And like she did not really get that I was like trying to ask for the name of like what is the name Chinese name for a tower, which is like not even that important to this conversation because she like understood my meaning. But
Yeah.
eventually got to the point where she was like describing how to say like the Burj Khalifa in
Uh-huh.
Chinese because she thought I was asking her like how do you say the name of the tallest tower like in
Yeah, yeah,
Chinese. I'm just like, this is so cooked. We haven't even got to the story. But she was like a big Cixin Liu super fan, and she had like quotes from him like on her like wall and stuff, which was kind of cool.
Is he like actually just like one of the most popular authors period in China?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Like the most, do you think? At
Um,
least among people
no,
our
not.
age?
I mean, I don't think the most. I don't think the most.
Okay,
Uh,
okay.
but I mean, I do think there's a pretty strong awareness of him, mostly because like The Wandering Earth was just this massive movie.
Oh yeah, that's
Like
fair.
he's more famous for The Wandering Earth than Three Body. I think he might be more famous for The Wandering Earth than Three Body amongst like the general populace, because like Wandering Earth was like, you know, an Avengers level blockbuster. But yeah, I mean, I also think that like in terms of like people actually reading the book, I don't think he's like the most popular. I think like web novels and shit are probably like more popular.
Okay. Yeah.
And like Ma Boyong, for example, might be more
Uh huh.
popular. Like the Great Migration dude.
Yeah.
That person also knew what Shameless was, which I was kind of surprised by.
That is kind of strange.
Like she was like, Chicago, like Shameless. I'm like,
Shameless.
you know what Shameless is? Like what? I haven't even seen Shameless.
Yeah. Shameless is very centered in Chicago.
Yeah. But yeah, I want to talk a little bit about like the one dude I talked to for a bit who informed a lot of this article, this guy Paul. So I was talking to a friend who I have in real life. He's like a pretty good friend of mine from Shandong, and he studied in the U.S. And I was asking if he knew anyone that like knew about science fiction, and so he put me in touch with like these random people on Discord who I think he found on social media somehow. And there's this one guy named Paul who I was talking about who was like going to university in the U.S. and studying writing, and so he was able to tell me about various like Chinese sci-fi things. And so we had like this pretty long conversation in Discord where he mentioned the Centennial Law or the Century Law by Muneki Yamada, which I was like, it's so hard to find this book. He's just like, you guys are like missing out on Japanese sci-fi. But like, I think what I was imagining in my head when he said that was just so different. You know, like I was imagining like we're missing out on mainstream Japanese sci-fi. But in fact, I think mainstream Japanese sci-fi might be more popular in America than in China. I don't super have basis to say that, but like, I don't know. The books, like, I don't think China is caring about like Project Ito and stuff like that. I think it's mostly just like these other like big people. Mystery fiction's really big in China.
Okay.
And I think China,
like more so than the U.S.
Yeah, and I think like Japan is actually known for having like some of the best mystery fiction.
Okay.
Like there's this one author, Keigo Higashino, I think. He's like listed as one of the like default interests you can pick on the language learning app, like in your profile, like a tag. So
that's kind of crazy.
You know, like you can pick like Taylor Swift or like Justin Bieber or like Keigo Higashino.
Yeah.
I mean, The Wandering Earth is a tag as well. But yeah, you can just like put in Keiko Higashino. And that's just like an interest that I've seen in like multiple people's profile. It's like pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So I think it just may be an outgrowth of Japanese mystery just being super huge in China, and then just kind of those authors just being known as a result.
But they are like pretty sci-fi at least, right?
Oh, they're very sci-fi. Like they're so
Yeah.
sci-fi. Like did you see the plots of those? I mean, Klein Bottle is just about like this. It's like this kind of Philip K. Dick-esque story about these people who are like in a virtual reality game, and they kind of become less able to differentiate like what is going on versus like what's in the game. And then like I forget what From the New World is, but it apparently has like some very serious speculative biology in it. And then the Century Law is just like this dystopian novel about like the government makes this law that people can't live to be like more than 100, that is to take effect at a certain date. And there's like, yeah, this is fine. I forget how they said it to be, but then it's like about to be the time where they're actually supposed to start like killing people, and everyone's just kind of like, are we sure about this?
Yeah. These are some good premises.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the point that I wanted to make earlier about like the different views that like a curator has is like, I think similar to an author, I think that a context is kind of like maybe less able to pick out the things that they think would be most salient to like a general audience. Like if you're really in it, and like if you're really into like, I don't know, golden age sci-fi, like at the time of it coming out, I think the things that you would pull to kind of present to an audience might be much more relevant to your context than you realize, right? Like as an author, you might be really into this one detail that drives a lot of the story. And this could be very interesting on like a podcast, but it's not something that's good for like a general elevator pitch. But in your mind, it's like kind of the most core thing. But then when you try to like transmit it out, it's like not as coherent. I think there's like a similar thing going on with like sci-fi, where like, I don't know, there's some reason that's very contextual for why someone is explaining a certain thing in the way that they are, but then this is just kind of like, maybe it could be better done by an outsider. And so I think like a curator is in a really good position to describe, to like give like an elevator pitch specifically for some work.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's fair. I think. I think you have to. It's like a curator. You have to think about the work like along those lines, like a bit
Right,
more.
right. I mean, you actually do have to do the pitch, right? Like if you're like a writer,
Yeah.
you're not even doing your own elevator pitch, right? You like hire someone to do it.
Yeah, I mean, like, you probably have to do your own elevator pitch some amount, but still, it's like it can go over well a bit to be like a bit like woo woo about this story as you're giving your pitch, but to like a publisher or something, right? But like then to a general audience, it's like you do want to have someone who can like really get to the heart of like what's most attractive about this work to a large number of people.
Yeah, and I'm not roasting authors for this because I think I'm going to be even more susceptible to this than like the average person. It's like, well, see, I was thinking about this one time when I went on this one website.
Yeah. And like, I think on some level, if you're in like a long conversation with someone, I think this is good, right? Like, you don't really want to get like, if you're talking to an author, you don't want to get like the pitch you could like find on Amazon if you like look up their book, right? You want to get like a story, but yeah, if you do want to also be able to give like the more corporate elevator pitch as well.
Well, I think that's a pretty good time to wrap things up. As a final note, Gordon, are there any short stories that you would like to recommend?
Yeah, so I recently read the Paper Menagerie collection by Ken Liu, and I like this collection quite a bit overall, I would say. Honestly, kind of surprising I hadn't read it in the past, but probably my favorite story from this collection was this story called The Litteromancer, which is sort of this tragic story taking place in Taiwan in, like, I want to say the 50s or 60s or something, where tensions are quite high at the time. Just a very kind of cute, but also at the start and then quite tragic story. But yeah, would definitely recommend.
All right. Well, thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next week.